Hello and welcome to the Western PA CoC Written Standards Training specifically for emergency shelter providers. My name is Jessica Sones. I work with Diana T. Myers and Associates, and we're the consultant for the Western PA CoC. So for those who may not be familiar with the written standards, HUD requires that all CoCs have a set of written standards, and the goal of them is to provide guidance for CoC and ESG programs related to how these programs deliver services. And the written standards serve to ensure that all programs have the resources and information to operate in a consistent and coordinated way, and also to operate in a way that's compliant with HUD and CoC standards. So if you haven't taken a look at the written standards yet, the full document, I would encourage you to take a look at that. We did a training on standards for all project types, and those are the standards that apply across the board regardless of which type of project you're operating. So if you have not watched that, please check it out. In addition to what we're going to be reviewing today, the standards for all project types also apply to emergency shelter. So in the written standards document, you'll see that there's a section for standards for all project types. Then there's a section for standards for each project type. So standards for specific to PSH or rapid rehousing or emergency shelter. You'll also see in the standards that there's an appendices section, which includes helpful resources that are referenced throughout the written standards document. And lastly, there's a templates resource, and that is a separate document from the written standards themselves, and it provides helpful form templates that programs can use when implementing their projects. So for example, a documentation of homelessness form, documentation of income form, documentation of disability. These forms are not required, but we hope they'll be a helpful resource for projects as they're either starting up or revamping their program or just wanting to make sure that all of the forms they use are compliant with all the things that HUD will be looking for. So let's dive into the standards for emergency shelter projects specifically. So as you all know, the goals for emergency shelter projects is to exit households to permanent housing as quickly as possible. It is a housing-focused approach, and housing should always be the #1 goal in mind. And upon admission to emergency shelter programs, all households should be assessed through coordinated entry to make sure that they have an expedited pathway to permanent housing. The CoC does recommend that all emergency shelter programs, regardless of funding source, follow the CoC written standards to the furthest extent possible. So in terms of accessing emergency shelter, how can folks access emergency shelter? So shelters can accept participant referrals from a variety of places, from coordinated entry, from other agencies, or from the participant themselves. One key thing to keep in mind regarding folks accessing shelter is that there is a focus on diversion. So shelter staff should explore all options that may be available to the household prior to enrolling that household in emergency shelter. And you'll find a little bit more info on diversion in the full written standards document. Regarding domestic violence, to the furthest extent possible, households fleeing DV should be referred to the local domestic violence agency for safe shelter when that's possible or when that is a resource that the household is interested in. In terms of eligibility for emergency shelter, it's pretty broad. Folks who are literally homeless are eligible, folks who are at imminent risk of homelessness are eligible, and as well as folks who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence. In terms of kind of the rules around emergency shelters may be in a position of needing to exit someone for their program or deny entry or future stays, but those should really be limited to safety related issues. So examples would be violence towards other guests or staff, excessive damage to the property, theft, need for medical services beyond those the shelter is equipped to provide. The asterisk is referencing that within trying to make accommodations within the Americans with Disabilities Act as much as possible. Any known abuser of a current residence may be denied entry or future stays, and depending on the location of the project and the client served, potentially sex offenders registered on the Megan's Law list. However, we use the word may. These are not necessarily automatic, most of these are not automatic scenarios where someone would need to be denied entry or future stays. This should really be done on an individualized basis, done on a trauma-informed basis as well, to try to make sure that folks can access the resources they need, even if they're facing specific challenges at that time or may have, for example, behavioral health needs. In terms of prioritization, each shelter is responsible for establishing their own prioritization standards. The CoC has prioritization standards for permanent housing projects, for example, permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing, but each shelter is responsible for establishing what makes sense for them. In terms of emergency transfers due to domestic violence, we just want to note that if someone needs to move from a shelter due to domestic violence, the provider should offer an alternate unit within the organization's own inventory whenever possible, if safe to do so. So if someone's residing in one building and there's another building available in a different location, that may not always be possible. So if an alternate unit is not available, the provider should follow the process outlined in the emergency transfer plan. You can find those materials in the full written standards document. And emergency transfer requests may be expedited and prioritized in order to make sure that a household can move as quickly as possible. In terms of documentation required for emergency shelter, documentation of homelessness or at risk of homelessness is required, and you can find a template for that in the written standards document. Emergency shelters should also work with participants to obtain their necessary documentation. So that could be ID documents, it could be documentation of disability, documentation of chronic homelessness, the documents that that household may need as they transition to permanent housing. And then you'll want to check out the full written standards, the documentations for all project types for additional requirements. In terms of duration and amounts, there's not a maximum length of stay in emergency shelter that's set by the CoC. The CoC does have goals around how quickly folks can move to permanent housing, but there's not a set length of stay that is determined by the CoC. Shelters should avoid discharging guests, I mentioned this earlier, except when it's really a safety issue, when the person poses a danger to themselves or others. The goal is for households to be in shelter for as little amount of time as possible to obtain permanent housing, and shelters should provide flexibility related to the length of stay based on the individual needs. And another requirement of the CoC is that emergency shelter programs should not be charging fees to participants. Additional emergency shelter specific standards is that shelters should be engaging participants from day one to assess their housing barriers, develop housing plans, and link households to the right types of assistance. And discharge, as much as possible, should always be to a permanent housing resource. Shelters are required to comply with HUD's equal access rules. So what that means for shelters is family shelters must serve all family compositions. So it can't be limited, if you're receiving HUD funding, it can't be limited to a specific gender of head of household of family. You can't limit it to, for example, children over the age of X are not allowed in the shelter. And then the second piece of that is that persons must be accepted into shelters in accordance with their gender identity, so the gender with which they identify and present themselves. Emergency shelters that serve families with children, I mentioned this briefly, are prohibited from denying assistance to or separating members of a family with children based on gender or age. So for example, you can't limit it and say if you have a male child over the age of 14, they're not allowed. That is not in compliance with HUD's equal access rule. In addition, shelters need to ensure that they're complying with fair housing and Americans with Disabilities Act compliance regarding service and support animals, and you'll find some resources for that in the full written standards. Emergency shelters must have a non-discrimination policy. Emergency shelters, to the furthest extent possible, should have 24/7 hours of operation. Emergency shelters should be operating with a low barrier approach, meaning that if folks have certain barriers that they're coming to the shelter with, for example, substance use, they have no income, they have, other needs, the shelter should not be denying folks entry because of the barriers that they're coming to the shelter with. It should be trying to support folks no matter what they're coming to the program with. There must be access to staff during hours of project operation. There must be access to food preparation and food storage space. And projects should establish a secure space for folks to store their personal possessions. In addition to storing personal possessions, there should be a place for secure storage of medications, especially in family shelters. Smoking is prohibited in buildings that provide shelter to children. Weapons may not be brought into emergency shelter, and shelter guests may not bring or use illegal substances or alcohol on the premises. I noted a low barrier approach, which often may mean, folks may be coming to a program with substance abuse history, and that may be just part of where they're at the time they come to you, but you can still limit and say you may not bring or use the substances on these premises. Shelter staff should conduct an initial service assessment within 7 days of intake, meaning that folks should be connected with coordinated entry, emergency service needs should be prioritized, and folks should be connected with all the housing resources that they may be eligible for. And then the shelter should be doing weekly reassessments. In terms of performance measures, the goal is really to move households into permanent housing as quickly as possible. And the CoC's goal is that is less than 30 days. So we know that there's not a limit on the maximum amount of time, but the goal should be within 30 days. We know there's limits to this because of coordinated entry, lack of permanent housing resources in the CoC, but this is a goal to kind of have on the radar and strive toward. And the goal is also that at least 47% of households are exiting to permanent housing from the shelter. In addition, we want to see that clients are not returning to homelessness within 2 years of an exit to permanent housing. So that's the quick overview of the standards that are specific to emergency shelters. In terms of next steps, all CoC and ESG funded programs must sign off by July 1st that their programs understand the standards and will implement them. And you will find a link to that we've sent out with all the materials. If you find that there are standards that your program is not implementing, projects need to make a plan to implement those standards by September 1st, 2021. And if you have feedback on the written standards, please feel free and encouraged to submit that year-round. There is a link that will be sent out to submit feedback year-round. You may find as you review the standards that certain sections need additional clarity, or you have additional ideas for how the standards could be improved. Please feel free to send that at any time. If you have any questions as you're working through the written standards, please feel free to email westerncoc@pennsylvaniacoc.org. Thank you for your time.